Well, growing up, I was always a bit of a risk taker, and I also didn't feel 100% comfortable in my own skin as a teenager. Although outwardly everything looked fine, inwardly I didn't feel great. Some insecurities, and it was a little bit more than just usual teenage angst. There was some depression involved, some mental issues with regard to that. As a way to cope with that, I found that if I drank beer and smoked pot, that I wouldn't have those uncomfortable feelings anymore. Unfortunately, doing that, I never developed the coping skills I probably should have developed to deal with those thoughts and emotions in effective manners. So that's when I first started realizing that, I could self-medicate and feel better about the world. Of course, we know that that's really a house of cards, and it cannot be sustained. I was a fairly high achiever. Well, I went into the Marine Corps Judge Advocate General program, and during a training mission, night land navigation, I fell down basically a crevasse, a cliff, and I hurt my back. At the time in the Marines, you couldn't go and get proper treatment. They would just either send you home, essentially ending your career, or at least this was my perception. And then if you said you were injured, now you were sort of like, the bird with the wounded wing, and you were kind of left behind in training. So I kept my mouth shut, and I treated it with Motrin, my back injury, with Motrin, heating pads, that kind of thing. Spent 4 years with the Marines, left the Marines and joined the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. as a prosecutor. Now I wasn't in the Marines, so I could very easily go to a civilian doctor to get pain meds for my back. And I found the perfect doctor for somebody like me. And he started to prescribe hydrocodone and oxycodone, pretty much in the numbers, whatever I wanted. You go into survival mode, essentially, and you do what you can to get through and to make it. But again, as it was as a high school student, it was a house of cards, and there's no way I could maintain it. Ultimately, I left the Justice Department and moved back up to upstate New York from Washington, D.C. From there, I went to a law firm in Albany. I couldn't get the same level of prescription drugs, pain meds that I was getting down in D.C. up here. Doctors just were saying, no, we're not going to treat, there's too much scrutiny for doctors, and they get in trouble if they over-treat pain. And I suspect some of the doctors probably thought I was addicted. Again, that self-medication component, but now not only was it a mental thing, but it was physically craving opiates. The straw broke when I couldn't get a doctor to prescribe anything, and I turned to an old friend who I knew, and he got OxyContin, which I'd never tried before. Completely different animal, right? It's heroin in a pill. Within 3 or 4 days of using OxyContin, I was full-blown addicted. When those ran out, I started to go through withdrawals, which I describe withdrawals typically to high school kids, college kids that I speak to, or different organizations, as the flu times 20. It's the worst pain I've ever felt. So I call that guy who got me the OxyContins, and he goes, I don't know what's going on. He goes, the guy got arrested. So after about 10 minutes on the phone with me screaming at him, asking him why I'm throwing up, why does I feel bugs crawling on my skin, he says, come over. So I go over to his house, and he puts a little bit of heroin on a mirror. Now, I'd never used heroin, right? I'd seen it as a prosecutor, and I knew immediately what it was, and I did it. Immediately, the pain of the withdrawals went away. Unfortunately, within 4 or 5 days of using heroin, now I was full-blown addicted to heroin. And if I didn't do it, I became physically sick. And as I was explaining to somebody earlier, you tried to kick the habit by yourself because you don't want anybody to know, and you might make it a day, but eventually that throwing up and that terrible feeling becomes so big that all you have to do is go and spend $10, get some heroin, and the feeling goes away. It came out one day that I was so sick I called my brother, I was lying on the bathroom floor, covered in my own vomit, and I told him I could trust him. And so he didn't tell my wife what was going on. And he rushed me to the hospital, and I went through a detox facility at a local hospital, got into a 28-day program, and was released. But 28 days isn't long enough for opiates, we know that. And then the direction was like, well, go to 12-step meetings. And 12-step meetings are great for some people, but they're not great for all people. And it just wasn't a good fit for me. One of the things that attracts me to addiction campuses of America is that it's not a one-size-fit-all proposition, right? They do a thorough intake and they try to figure out the best plan for each individual, and that's unique within the industry. Eventually I lost my job due to the relapses, and still couldn't see my children, even when I put together some solid months of sobriety. The family court judge was unrelenting. Not his fault, right? I mean, I wasn't the picture of hope standing in front of him in court. I get that. But I became angry and despondent and depressed, and all these things came together. And then one day I was going to family court. I knew I was going to suffer another loss, and I drove north of Lake George, New York. I went to the first bank that I could find, and I robbed it. Not proud of the fact, over the next 6 weeks, I robbed 5 more banks, 2 grocery stores. Ultimately was caught following, obviously, my final robbery. Just a traumatic time for me. I don't blame anybody but myself. Even though I was in the compulsion stage of addiction, I still could have asked for or availed myself of more help. But I do know that the 28 days wasn't enough. I would say for any addiction, but especially opiates. There just has to be a longer stay because it still calls to you months and months later. So that is a regret that I didn't do more than the 28 days. Anyhow, so I get arrested. I've never been in jail before, and I get sent to the local county jail. Worst experience of my life. Withdrawing on the floor of the prison in the medical unit, throwing up, vomiting, guards, COs laughing at me. Just humiliating and just miserable. Ultimately, I pled guilty to the robberies and was sentenced to 65 months in federal prison. Didn't wear a disguise other than a baseball cap. So in the nightly news, I would see myself in the footage that was released from the banks to the press. And I was even there one time with my friend, and he said, Andrew, that looks just like you. And I looked at the TV, and in just my state of absolute, the lowest point in my life, I said, no, that's not me. And in a way, it really wasn't me. It was somebody in the throes of the demonic addiction from opiates. So I get that, and when I speak to people in recovery or addicts, I can relate to them on that level. A lot of people can't. A lot of people would just say, well, if it was hurting you, why wouldn't you just stop it? And I wish it were that simple. If it were that simple, we wouldn't need the treatment facilities that we desperately need, and the more beds that we need. I'm in the Northeast, in New York, and Vermont, Massachusetts, and I hear from parents, teachers, clinicians all the time, we have no place to put these people, they're not enough. Through therapy, I kind of came to the realization in treatment that it had more to do with anger and depression and frustration. Anger at myself, anger at the system, whether it was misplaced or not. That's what I was feeling at the time. Clearly, I'm not a sociopath, so clearly I had just gone off the rails. But that other piece that I was talking about, the realization that I knew that I had got myself here and that how many people I had hurt, because once you get clean and sober, the fog lifts, and then your conscience comes back, and you realize all these people that loved you, and still tough to talk about, and how you would hurt them. But I came to realize that if I hung on to this guilt and the shame of what I had done and everything that had happened, that I couldn't be the best person I could be for them. So it would be almost like I'm victimizing them again because I'm carrying this enormous burden on my shoulders. So at some point in my mind, there was a turning point, and I forgave myself. It sounds a little corny, but that's what has to happen, in my view. And you have to make the conscious decision to move on with your life, because that's what's best for you and that's what's best for the people around you. You have to establish trust, not just with the children. That kind of comes naturally because you love them and they love you, kind of thing. So that's okay. And again, I think their ages contributed to that and played a part in that. Excuse me. And but with adults, family and friends, that was an issue because they're watching to see what you're going to do. They saw you at your best. They saw you at your lowest. There's a way out of where you are right now. You don't want to be that person anymore, right? You've gone past the enjoyable, drug use, right? That ends very quickly with opiates. You have to put the idea of the stigma aside, and you have to ask for help, and you have to get into a treatment program, and it can't be a short-term thing. Don't worry about today. Don't worry about tomorrow. Get to where you need to be, because unless you take some positive changes and get the help you need, you're going to be useless to everybody. As I said earlier, this whole thing is just a big house of cards. Opiate use and abuse is a house of cards, and it's going to come down. And so it's already down for him because he's already thinking about shooting up because he doesn't want to feel sick anymore. But my story ultimately is a story of hope and redemption. And that is that there's a way out, and there's hope to that end. But you have to seek that help. You have to ask for that help, and it's there. It's there.